The nation aroused. The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned clear and peaceful over Pearl Harbor. By evening, that peace lay shattered beneath twisted metal and burning oil, and with it died America's illusion of safety behind two vast oceans. In the weeks that followed, as the full scope of the disaster became clear, a singular question echoed through the corridors of the Pentagon, across factory floors, humming with sudden urgency, and in the quiet conversations of a nation suddenly at war. What could be done to strike back? The answer would come from an unlikely source, not from the grand strategies of generals or the calculated moves of admirals, but from the restless mind of a test pilot who understood that sometimes the most impossible plans are the only ones worth attempting. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but his reputation towered over the aviation community. At 45, he possessed that rare combination of technical brilliance and operational daring that marked the truly exceptional military aviator. His hands, calloused from years of gripping control sticks and adjusting engine components, had guided aircraft through maneuvers that existed only in theory until he proved them possible. His mind, trained in the rigorous disciplines of aeronautical engineering at MIT, could calculate fuel loads and wind vectors with slide rule precision, while simultaneously envisioning tactical possibilities that escaped more conventional thinkers. In the grey January days of 1942, as America struggled to comprehend the scope of its new reality, Doolittle found himself summoned to a meeting that would change the course of his life and, in ways both subtle and profound, the trajectory of the war itself. The Pentagon in those early months of 1942 possessed an energy unlike anything in its brief existence. Construction workers still hammered and welded in sections of the massive building, their sounds mixing with the constant click of typewriter keys and the urgent conversations of officers adapting to a conflict that spanned the globe. The smell of fresh concrete mingled with cigarette smoke and the leather of hurriedly manufactured briefcases. Maps covered every available wall surface, their surfaces marked with colored pins that seemed to multiply daily as the scope of America's commitments became clear. It was here that General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had been wrestling with a problem that seemed to defy solution. President Roosevelt himself had made the requirement clear. America needed to strike back at Japan, and soon. Not merely for military advantage, though that mattered, but for something more fundamental. The American people needed to know that their military could reach across the Pacific and touch the empire that had dared to attack them at home. The challenge appeared insurmountable. Japan lay 4,000 miles from the nearest American base, well beyond the range of any existing bomber when carrying a meaningful payload. The Japanese combined fleet controlled the Western Pacific with a confidence born of 6 months of virtually uninterrupted victory. Their carrier forces, the same ships that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, patrolled waters that no American surface vessel could hope to penetrate. Yet Arnold had learned, in his decades of military service, that impossible problems sometimes yielded to impossible solutions. The idea that eventually reached his desk came from Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine officer whose mind worked in the lateral patterns that naval service often cultivated. Lowe had been watching Army bombers practice takeoffs from a field in Norfolk when the thought struck him. If bombers could take off from an airfield, why not from an aircraft carrier? The concept was breathtaking in its audacity. No Army bomber had ever attempted a carrier takeoff. The distances involved meant it would be a one-way mission. The crews would have to find some way to reach safety after their bombing runs, with China representing the only realistic possibility. Every aspect of the operation would push men and machines beyond their designed limits. Arnold studied the proposal with the methodical care of an engineer examining blueprints for a bridge that must not fail. The B-25 Mitchell bomber emerged as the only aircraft with the right combination of size, range, and payload capacity. Even so, the margins were razor-thin. The bombers would have to be stripped of every non-essential component, their fuel tanks modified to carry maximum loads, their crews trained for a type of takeoff that existed nowhere in any manual. Most critically, Arnold needed someone to lead this mission, who combined technical expertise with the kind of leadership that could inspire men to volunteer for what might well be a suicide mission. His choice was immediate and instinctive: James Doolittle. When Doolittle received the summons to Arnold's office on that cold February morning, He expected another test pilot assignment, or perhaps a consultation on some technical matter. Instead, he found himself listening to a proposal that seemed to exist at the intersection of military necessity and pure fantasy. Arnold laid out the concept with characteristic directness. 16 B-25 bombers would be loaded aboard the aircraft carrier Hornet. The task force would sail to within 400 miles of Japan, launch the bombers, and the aircraft would proceed to bomb targets in Japan before continuing to airfields in China. The crews would be volunteers only, and they would be told from the beginning that the mission carried exceptional risks. Doolittle listened in silence, his engineer's mind already calculating weights and fuel loads, takeoff distances and navigation challenges. When Arnold finished, he asked a single question: "When do we start?" The answer came with typical military efficiency: immediately. Within days, Doolittle found himself at Eglin Field in Florida, staring at a runway marked with white lines that represented the deck of an aircraft carrier. The lines looked impossibly short. A B-25, fully loaded, typically required twice that distance for takeoff. Yet somehow, these bombers would have to break free of the Earth in less than 500 feet, carrying maximum fuel and a ton of bombs each. The first test flights were exercises in controlled terror. Pilots accustomed to long runways and generous safety margins found themselves pulling back on control sticks with the end of the simulated deck rushing toward them at alarming speed. Some made it, others did not, at least not initially. But gradually, through repetition and the kind of incremental improvement that marked all successful military training, the impossible began to seem merely improbable. Doolittle had put out a call for volunteers, though he could not tell them what they were volunteering for. The response exceeded all expectations. Experienced bomber crews stepped forward, drawn by the promise of action after months of training and the magnetic pull of Doolittle's reputation. They came from squadrons across the country, men in their 20s mostly, with the kind of confidence that allowed them to climb into machines that weighed 15 tons and trust their lives to engines and airframes that were themselves barely out of the experimental stage. The selection process was rigorous. Doolittle needed crews who could handle the technical demands of the mission while maintaining the psychological resilience that such an operation would require. He looked for pilots who could adapt quickly to new procedures, bombardiers who could find and hit targets in unfamiliar territory, and gunners who understood that they might have to defend their aircraft over some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. As February gave way to March, the training intensified. The crews practiced short takeoffs until the procedure became automatic. They studied photographs of Japanese cities, memorizing landmarks and target approaches. They learned survival techniques for operations over water and behind enemy lines. Most importantly, they developed the kind of unit cohesion that would allow them to function effectively under the extreme stress of combat operations. Through it all, the secrecy remained absolute. The men knew they were training for something important and dangerous, but the specifics remained hidden. They speculated, of course, as soldiers always do, but their guesses fell far short of the reality. How could they imagine that they would soon be the first American airmen to bomb the Japanese home islands? How could they envision themselves taking off from a carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific, bound for targets that existed only as photographs and map coordinates? The answer to those questions would come soon enough. By the end of March, the training phase was complete. The crews had mastered short takeoffs, navigation over water, and the 100 other skills they would need for survival. The bombers had been modified with additional fuel tanks, stripped of unnecessary weight, and loaded with the special ordnance they would carry to Japan. Now came the final phase: the movement to the West Coast and the rendezvous with a carrier task force that was already preparing for one of the most audacious operations in naval history. The USS Hornet waited at Alameda Naval Air Station, her flight deck cleared and her crew briefed for a mission unlike anything they had ever attempted. As the B-25s were hoisted aboard the carrier, their wings nearly spanning the width of the flight deck, even the most experienced naval aviators shook their heads in amazement. The sight of Army bombers lashed to a carrier deck challenged every assumption about what was possible in naval aviation. But possibility, Doolittle had learned long ago, was often simply a matter of perspective. What seemed impossible from one angle might reveal itself as merely difficult from another. And difficult, he had discovered throughout his career, was simply another word for interesting. The task force that would carry these bombers toward Japan represented more than ships and aircraft. It embodied America's determination to strike back, to prove that no attack would go unanswered, and to demonstrate that American ingenuity could overcome even the most daunting challenges. As the Hornet slipped her moorings and headed toward the Golden Gate Bridge, her deck crowded with bombers that had never been designed for carrier operations, a new chapter in the Pacific War was beginning to unfold. The navigator's task. The weight of the mission fell heaviest on 16 men whose names would never appear in headlines, whose faces would remain unknown to history. These were the navigators, the quiet professionals who would guide their crews across 3,000 miles of empty ocean with nothing but stars, mathematics, and steady nerves. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy adjusted his plotting board as the USS Hornet's deck pitched beneath him. The B-25 Mitchell bomber felt alien here, lashed to the carrier's deck like some prehistoric bird forced into an unnatural roost. But it was the navigation station that truly revealed the audacity of what they were attempting. Where carrier-based aircraft relied on radio beacons and the reassuring presence of their floating runway, these Army bombers would venture into the void with only the most fundamental tools of aerial navigation. The Pacific Ocean stretched before them like a blue infinity. No landmarks, no roads, no familiar reference points that ground-based navigation could provide. Just water. Endless water that could swallow 16 bombers without a trace if their navigators miscalculated by even a few degrees. Each navigator carried the lives of 4 other men in his calculations. The pilot might control the aircraft, but the navigator controlled their destiny. One error in celestial computation, one mistake in dead reckoning, and an entire crew would vanish into the vastness of the Pacific. The responsibility was crushing, and these men had volunteered for it. The selection process for Doolittle's navigators had been ruthless in its precision. The Army Air Forces had combed through personnel files, seeking men with not just technical competence, but the psychological fortitude to perform complex calculations under extreme stress. They needed navigators who could work in cramped, vibrating cockpits while anti-aircraft fire burst around them. Men who could maintain their concentration during the most terrifying moments of their lives. Lieutenant Charles Ozuk spread his charts across the small navigation table, the paper crackling under his fingers. These weren't the detailed topographical maps that Army pilots were accustomed to. Instead, they showed vast expanses of blue marked only with depth soundings and the occasional shipping lane. The scale was almost incomprehensible, each inch representing hundreds of miles of ocean where a single degree of error could mean the difference between reaching China and disappearing forever. The tools of their trade were deceptively simple. A sextant for celestial navigation, its polished brass reflecting the subdued lighting of the navigation station. A plotting board marked with compass roses and distant scales. Tables of logarithms and trigonometric functions. A chronometer that had to maintain perfect accuracy across thousands of miles because even a few seconds of error could throw off their position by miles. But the most critical tool was the navigator's mind, trained to perform complex mathematical calculations while engines roared and aircraft bucked through turbulence. These men had spent months learning to shoot star fixes in conditions that would challenge a surveyor on solid ground. They had practiced dead reckoning until they could track their position across vast distances, using only compass headings, airspeed, and elapsed time. The sensory environment of the B-25's navigation station was a world unto itself. The constant throb of the twin Wright R2600 engines created a vibration that penetrated every surface, every instrument, every bone in the navigator's body. The smell was a mixture of aviation gasoline, hot metal, and the peculiar metallic tang of high-altitude air. Instrument lights cast an amber glow across charts and calculations, creating a cocoon of focused concentration within the larger chaos of flight. Lieutenant Denver Truelove checked his compass bearing for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The magnetic compass was their primary reference, but it was subject to deviation from the aircraft's metal structure and the electrical systems humming around them. Each B-25 had been individually calibrated, its compass errors mapped and recorded on correction cards that the navigators had memorized. A 2-degree error, multiplied across 1,000 miles of flight, could put them hundreds of miles off course. The art of celestial navigation required a peculiar combination of scientific precision and intuitive skill. Using a sextant from the cramped confines of a bomber's astrodome was nothing like the leisurely process taught in navigation school. The aircraft's motion made it nearly impossible to hold a steady sight on a star or the sun. The navigator had to anticipate the aircraft's movement, timing his sextant readings to coincide with moments of relative stability. Each celestial fix required multiple steps, each one a potential source of error. First, the navigator would identify his celestial body, perhaps Polaris, the North Star, or Sirius, depending on the time of day and their position. Then came the delicate process of bringing the star down to the horizon through the sextant's mirrors, reading the angle with precision while the aircraft bounced through turbulence. The mathematics that followed were unforgiving. Using sight reduction tables and spherical trigonometry, the navigator would convert his sextant reading into a line of position on his chart. A single sight gave him only a line. Somewhere along that line was his actual position. Multiple sights from different celestial bodies would provide intersecting lines, and their intersection would reveal his location with an accuracy that seemed almost magical. But celestial navigation was only part of the navigator's burden. Dead reckoning, the process of tracking position based on course, speed, and time, required constant vigilance. Every course change had to be noted and plotted. Wind drift had to be calculated and compensated for. The navigator maintained a running plot of their track across the ocean, updating it every few minutes with new calculations. The wind was perhaps their greatest enemy. At bombing altitude, the jet stream could push their aircraft hundreds of miles off course, if not properly calculated. But determining wind speed and direction required careful observation and mathematical analysis. The navigator would note the difference between their compass heading and their actual track across the ground, then calculate the wind triangle that would account for this drift. Lieutenant Richard Cole, serving as Doolittle's co-pilot but trained as a navigator himself, understood the psychological pressure his fellow navigators faced. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. While pilots could see the horizon and feel the aircraft's response to their controls, navigators worked in a world of abstractions, numbers and calculations that represented life and death but felt removed from the immediate reality of flight. The training had been intensive, but nothing could truly prepare them for the reality of navigating across the Pacific's immensity. In training flights over the continental United States, there were always radio beacons, recognizable landmarks, and the comforting knowledge that an emergency landing field was never more than a few minutes away. Over the Pacific, there would be nothing. Just water and the terrible responsibility of finding Japan in an ocean that covered 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Each navigator had developed his own rituals and methods for maintaining accuracy under stress. Some worked in complete silence, shutting out the chaos around them to focus entirely on their calculations. Others maintained a constant dialogue with their pilots, sharing their progress and concerns as a way of managing anxiety. All of them understood that their crewmates' lives depended on the precision of their work. The approach to Japan would test every skill they possessed. Unlike the open ocean, where small errors could be corrected over time, the final approach required pinpoint accuracy. They had to find specific targets in a country they had never seen, using landmarks they knew only from intelligence photographs and briefing materials. The return journey would be even more challenging. After bombing their targets, the crews would face a flight across the China Sea to landing fields in unoccupied China. But these weren't the well-equipped air bases they were accustomed to. Many of the intended landing sites were little more than dirt strips marked by signal fires, if they were marked at all. The navigators would have to guide their aircraft through darkness and weather to fields that existed more in hope than reality. As the Hornet steamed westward through increasingly heavy seas, the navigators made their final preparations. They checked and double-checked their instruments, reviewed their flight plans, and mentally rehearsed the procedures they would follow once airborne. Each man carried backup equipment, spare sextants, additional chronometers, duplicate charts, because equipment failure over the Pacific meant almost certain death. The weight of responsibility pressed down on them like the ocean depths below the carrier. 16 aircraft, 80 men, and America's desperate need for a victory in the Pacific. all depending on their ability to navigate across an ocean that had swallowed countless ships and aircraft without a trace. In a few days, they would climb into their bombers and trust their lives to mathematics, celestial mechanics, and the steady hands of navigators who had trained for this moment but could never truly be ready for its reality. Hacked, setting sail on the Hornet. The morning of April the 1st, 1942, dawned grey and overcast at Naval Air Station Alameda in California. Through the mist rolling off San Francisco Bay, the massive silhouette of the USS Hornet emerged like a steel island anchored at Pier 3. At 688 feet long and displacing 25,000 tons, she was one of America's newest fleet carriers. But today she would attempt something no carrier had ever done before. On the dock beside her, 16 North American B-25B Mitchell bombers sat in precise rows, their olive-drab paint schemes still bearing the sharp scent of fresh modifications. Each aircraft had been stripped of unnecessary weight, fitted with additional fuel tanks, and equipped with special low-altitude bomb sights. The bombers looked oddly out of place next to the sleek Navy fighters typically found on carrier decks, like workhorses preparing to run a thoroughbreds race. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle stood watching as the first Mitchell was carefully positioned beneath the Hornet's massive crane. The loading process would be delicate work. Each B-25 weighed nearly 15 tons empty, and the margin for error was essentially zero. One miscalculation, one snapped cable, and months of preparation could be crushed beneath twisted aluminum and steel. The crane operator, a weathered chief petty officer named Sullivan, had practiced this maneuver dozens of times with mock-ups and calculations. Now, as the steel cables took the weight of the first bomber, every man on the dock held his breath. The Mitchell rose slowly, almost gracefully, its twin engines and distinctive twin tail catching the morning light as it swung over the carrier's deck. "Easy does it," Sullivan muttered into his headset, guiding the aircraft down onto the Hornet's flight deck with the precision of a surgeon. The bomber settled with a metallic groan, and immediately deck crews swarmed over it, securing tie-down chains and checking for any damage from the lift. One by one, the remaining 15 Mitchells made the same journey from dock to deck. The process took most of the day, with each aircraft requiring careful positioning to maximize the limited deck space. By evening, the Hornet's flight deck looked like no carrier deck in naval history. Crowded with twin-engine bombers whose wingspans nearly touched the ship's superstructure. The pilots and crews watched their aircraft being loaded with a mixture of pride and apprehension. These weren't just machines being moved. They were lifelines, the only way home after a mission deep in enemy territory. Each man had developed an almost personal relationship with his assigned bomber during weeks of training, learning its quirks, its sounds, its particular handling characteristics. Captain Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's commanding officer, surveyed the unusual cargo with professional satisfaction. At 45, Mitcher was an aviator's aviator, one of the Navy's early pioneers in carrier operations. He understood better than most the challenges ahead, not just for the bomber crews, but for his own ship and sailors. The Hornet would carry these Army bombers across 3,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, through waters increasingly dominated by Japanese submarines and patrol aircraft. She would do so while maintaining radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning and hoping that American intelligence was correct about enemy patrol patterns and capabilities. On April the 2nd, the Hornet cast off her moorings and headed west under the Golden Gate Bridge. The sight was both inspiring and sobering. 16 Army bombers lashed to her deck like a promise of retribution carried toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. Few of the sailors lining the rails understood the full scope of the mission, but all sensed its importance. Below decks, the bomber crews settled into quarters never designed for Army personnel. The Navy had done its best to accommodate 80 additional men, but space aboard a warship was always at a premium. Pilots and navigators found themselves sharing cramped compartments with bombardiers and gunners, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high with barely enough room to turn over. The close quarters bred both tension and camaraderie. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, pilot of the 7th Bomber, later described the experience as living like sardines in a can, but sardines with a shared purpose that made the discomfort bearable. Men who had trained together for weeks now lived together in an intimacy that would have been uncomfortable under any other circumstances. Days at sea developed their own rhythm. Morning briefings in the ship's ready room, where Doolittle and his staff reviewed navigation charts and weather reports. Afternoon maintenance sessions on the flight deck, where crews checked and rechecked their aircraft despite the salt spray and constant wind. Evening discussions in the wardroom, where pilots shared stories, concerns, and increasingly detailed plans for the mission ahead. The bombers themselves required constant attention. Salt air was the enemy of aircraft, corroding metal surfaces and degrading electrical systems with relentless efficiency. Each morning, crews climbed over their Mitchells, wiping down surfaces, checking control cables, and testing engines that had to remain ready for immediate use despite weeks of inactivity. Navigation remained the central challenge, and the 16 navigators spent hours each day refining their calculations. They worked with the Hornet's navigation team, comparing celestial observations and dead reckoning positions. The carrier's navigators were skilled professionals, but they were accustomed to operations with radio beacons, weather reports, and the ability to request position fixes from shore stations. This mission would offer none of those luxuries. Lieutenant Charles McClure, navigator for the 13th Bomber, filled notebook after notebook with calculations. Wind drift coefficients, fuel consumption rates, celestial navigation tables. All the mathematical tools that would guide 80 men across an ocean and, hopefully, back to safety. The numbers had to be perfect because there would be no second chances. As the Hornet steamed westward, the weather grew increasingly unpredictable. Spring storms in the North Pacific were notorious for their sudden violence, and the bomber crews watched with growing concern as waves began breaking over the carrier's bow. Each storm brought the risk of damage to their aircraft, lashed to the deck with only steel cables and chains for protection. The ship's meteorologist, Lieutenant Commander Francis Lowe, provided daily briefings that became increasingly important as the launch date approached. Wind direction and velocity would be critical factors in getting 16 heavily loaded bombers airborne from a 450-foot deck, a distance that would normally be considered impossibly short for aircraft of this size and weight. On April 13th, 11 days into the voyage, the Hornet rendezvoused with Task Force 16 under the command of Admiral William Bull Halsey. The sight of the Enterprise and her escort ships appearing on the horizon brought both relief and heightened tension. The mission was entering its final phase, and every man aboard understood that they were now deep in waters the Japanese considered their own domain. Admiral Halsey came aboard the Hornet for final consultations with Doolittle and Captain Mitchell. The plan called for the task force to approach within 400 miles of the Japanese coast before launching the bombers, close enough to ensure the B-25s could reach their targets, but far enough to keep the carriers relatively safe from immediate retaliation. The bomber crews used these final days to make last-minute preparations. Personal letters were written and sealed, to be mailed only if the writers failed to return. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Maps were studied until every detail was memorized. The 16 crews had become a tight-knit fraternity, bound together by shared danger and common purpose. But on the morning of April 18th, everything changed. At dawn, the task force was still 650 miles from the planned launch point when lookouts spotted a Japanese patrol vessel on the horizon. The enemy ship was quickly sunk by American cruisers, but the damage was done. Radio intercepts suggested the patrol boat had transmitted a warning before being destroyed. Admiral Halsey faced an impossible choice: launch the bombers immediately from a distance that would make their return even more problematic, or abort the mission entirely and retreat with the precious carriers intact. The decision came swiftly. The Hornet turned into the wind, and the order was given to prepare for immediate launch. The bomber crews received the news with grim determination. They had trained for this moment, prepared for this challenge, but launching 250 miles farther from Japan than planned meant their already slim chances of survival had just become even slimmer. There would be no turning back now. Only the hope that skill, courage, and a measure of luck would see them through the hours ahead. The flight to Tokyo. The first bomber lifted off the Hornet's deck at 8:20 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle himself at the controls. One by one, the remaining 15 B-25s followed, their engines straining against the Pacific headwinds as they clawed for altitude. The sight of those twin-engine bombers rising from a carrier deck, something that had never been attempted before in the history of warfare, marked the beginning of a journey that would test every skill these airmen possessed. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter settled into his position aboard the third aircraft, spreading his charts across the small table behind the pilot's seat. The mathematics of their situation were stark and unforgiving: 650 miles to the Japanese coast, with fuel calculations based on launching 250 miles closer. Every gallon would matter now. Every degree of course correction would need to be precise beyond measure. The Pacific stretched endlessly below them, a vast expanse of grey-green water broken only by the occasional whitecap. At their cruising altitude of 200 feet, flying low to avoid enemy radar, the ocean seemed to rush beneath them with hypnotic regularity. Potter checked his compass bearing, made notes on wind drift, and calculated their ground speed based on the waves below. Dead reckoning navigation at its most critical, with no margin for error. The weather began to deteriorate as they flew westward. What had started as scattered clouds soon developed into more substantial formations, forcing the pilots to weave between towering cumulus that could hide their aircraft from each other. The loose formation they had maintained began to stretch and separate. Radio silence was essential. Any transmission might alert Japanese listening posts, so each crew found themselves increasingly alone in the vast Pacific sky. Lieutenant Charles McClure, navigating the 7th bomber, watched the fuel gauges with growing concern. The early launch had consumed more fuel than planned during takeoff, and the headwinds were proving stronger than anticipated. He recalculated their consumption rate, cross-referenced it with their remaining distance to target, and felt his stomach tighten. They were operating at the absolute edge of their aircraft's capabilities. There would be no reserve, no safety margin, just the hope that their engines would continue running long enough to reach the Japanese mainland. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the steady drone of the Wright R2600 engines and the navigator's methodical plotting of their course. Every 30 minutes, a new position fix. Every hour, a fuel consumption check. The routine became almost meditative. Compass bearing, airspeed indicator, drift calculation, chart notation, the precision required was absolute. A single degree of error, maintained over hundreds of miles, could send them far off course into empty ocean. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, the weather continued to worsen. Thick cloud layers forced them to climb higher, burning more precious fuel. Rain began to streak across the windscreens, and visibility dropped dramatically. Some aircraft found themselves flying through towering storm cells, buffeted by turbulence that made navigation readings nearly impossible to take accurately. The psychological pressure on the navigators was immense. 80 lives, 16 crews, depended entirely on their ability to find a landmass in the middle of the world's largest ocean. There were no radio beacons to guide them, no landmarks to confirm their position. Only the compass, the airspeed indicator, and their own calculations stood between success and disaster. Lieutenant William Bauer, navigating the 11th aircraft, found himself constantly rechecking his work. The mathematics seemed sound, but doubt crept in during the long hours over water. Had he properly compensated for magnetic variation? Was his drift calculation accurate? The wind seemed to be shifting, coming more from the northwest now, pushing them slightly south of their intended track. He made the correction, noted the time, and hoped his judgment was correct. The ocean below began to change character as they flew deeper into Japanese-controlled waters. The color shifted from the deep blue of the open Pacific to a more greenish hue that suggested shallower coastal waters. Debris appeared occasionally, pieces of wood, patches of seaweed, the occasional fishing float. These small signs gave the navigators hope that they were indeed approaching the Asian mainland. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, nearly 4.5 hours after takeoff, the first crews began to spot land on the horizon. A low, dark line that gradually resolved into the mountainous coastline of Japan. The relief was palpable, though tempered by the knowledge that their most dangerous phase was just beginning. They had found their target, now they had to survive long enough to attack it. The Japanese coast appeared different than their intelligence photographs had suggested. Heavy cloud cover obscured many of the landmarks they had memorized during briefings. Rivers, harbors, and cities that should have been clearly visible were hidden beneath layers of grey overcast. The navigators found themselves having to identify their positions based on terrain features. the shape of a bay, the configuration of a mountain range, the general outline of the coastline. Lieutenant Thomas Griffin, aboard the ninth bomber, studied the landscape below with intense concentration. They needed to identify their exact position to ensure they attacked their assigned target. The mission planners had been specific. Each crew had been given a particular objective to minimize the chance of multiple aircraft attacking the same location. But the weather was making positive identification extremely difficult. The aircraft began to separate further as they crossed the Japanese coastline, each crew navigating toward their individual targets. Some headed for Tokyo, others toward Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The formation that had held together across 600 miles of ocean now dispersed across the Japanese archipelago, 16 separate missions converging on the industrial heart of the enemy homeland. The landscape below was surprisingly green and cultivated. Rice paddies formed geometric patterns across the valleys, while small villages dotted the countryside with remarkable density. This was not the barren, militaristic landscape that American propaganda had suggested, but a heavily populated agricultural region that had been supporting civilization for thousands of years. As they flew inland, the navigators began to see signs of Japan's military preparations. Airfields appeared with increasing frequency, some with aircraft visible on the ground. Anti-aircraft gun positions were evident around major installations. The country was clearly prepared for attack, but from a different direction. Their defenses were oriented toward the sea, expecting invasion fleets, not individual bombers approaching at rooftop level from an impossible direction. The weather continued to complicate their approach. Low clouds forced them to fly even lower, sometimes barely clearing hills and mountains. The turbulence was severe in places, making it difficult to maintain steady flight and accurate navigation. Several crews reported seeing other B-25s in the distance, brief glimpses of their fellow raiders also threading their way through the challenging conditions. Time became critical now. They had been airborne for over 5 hours, and fuel reserves were approaching the point of no return. Each crew had to balance the need for precise navigation to their target against the imperative of conserving fuel for their escape and the long flight to China. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to circle back for another approach. The navigators made their final calculations as they approached their assigned targets. Wind speed and direction for the bomb run, escape headings to carry them toward the Chinese coast, fuel consumption rates that would determine whether they had any hope of reaching friendly territory. Every decision now carried life or death consequences. The flight to Tokyo was nearly complete. 6 hours of precise navigation across hostile waters had brought them to this moment. The most audacious military operation in American history was about to reach its climax, as 16 B-25 bombers prepared to deliver a message that would echo across the Pacific and around the world. In the cramped navigator compartments of those aircraft, young men barely out of their 20s had just completed one of the most challenging navigation exercises in aviation history. Their skill and precision had overcome impossible odds, but their greatest test still lay ahead. The raid and aftermath. The first glimpse of the Japanese coastline appeared through breaks in the cloud cover like fragments of an ancient map. Dark green islands scattered across steel-grey waters. After 6 hours of flying over endless ocean, the sight of land brought both relief and a sharp edge of anticipation to the bomber crews. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, piloting his B-25 toward Tokyo, felt his pulse quicken as the coastline resolved into recognizable features. Below, fishing villages dotted the shoreline, their red tile roofs gleaming in the afternoon sun. It seemed almost peaceful, deceptively normal. The navigator beside him, Dean Davenport, cross-checked their position against his carefully plotted charts. They were exactly where they needed to be. Across the formation, now spread over hundreds of miles, the other 15 bombers were making their final approach to their assigned targets. Each crew had trained for this moment for weeks, studying photographs and models until they could navigate Tokyo's streets in their sleep. Now those preparations would be put to the ultimate test. The Japanese air defense system, so formidable in theory, proved surprisingly unprepared for this unprecedented attack. Radar stations along the coast had detected incoming aircraft, but the idea of American bombers approaching from the east, from the vast Pacific, seemed impossible. Fighter squadrons scrambled, but they were looking for the wrong type of aircraft in the wrong places. Doolittle's bomber was among the first to reach its target area. As Tokyo spread out beneath them, the colonel could see the urban landscape that intelligence photographs had made familiar. The Imperial Palace grounds, the Sumida River winding through the city, the dense neighborhoods of wooden buildings. At 1,500 feet, flying at nearly 300 miles per hour, details flashed past with startling clarity. The bomb bay doors opened with a mechanical whir that could be felt through the aircraft's frame. Bombardier Fred Bramer made final adjustments to his Norden bomb sight, the precision instrument that would guide their ordnance to its target. The first bombs fell away with barely perceptible jolts, 4 500-pound incendiaries that would announce America's return to the Pacific War. Across Tokyo, similar scenes played out as the other bombers found their targets. The Nakajima Aircraft Factory in the city's industrial district, the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company, military installations that had been carefully selected for their strategic value. Each crew executed their bombing run with professional precision, their months of training compressed into a few crucial minutes over enemy territory. The Japanese response, when it finally materialized, was confused and largely ineffective. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, sending black puffs of flak into the sky, but the gunners were tracking targets they had never expected to see. Fighter aircraft roared overhead, but most arrived after the bombers had already completed their runs and were racing toward the western horizon. For the American airmen, the strangest aspect of those minutes over Japan was the surreal normalcy of life continuing below. People walked the streets, traffic moved along the boulevards, children played in schoolyards. The war, which had consumed their thoughts and shaped their training for months, seemed oddly distant from the everyday life unfolding beneath their wings, but their mission was only half complete. As the last bombs fell and the B-25s turned toward China, a new and perhaps even more dangerous phase began. The fuel gauges, already showing critically low levels, would determine whether this bold stroke would end in triumph or tragedy. The original plan had called for the bombers to land at Chinese airfields controlled by friendly forces, but the early launch from the Hornet had consumed precious fuel reserves. What had been a challenging but manageable flight to sanctuary now became a desperate race against empty tanks and approaching darkness. Navigator Charles McClure, aboard Lieutenant Dick Joyce's aircraft, worked frantically with his charts and instruments as the Chinese coast appeared ahead. The mountainous terrain, shrouded in mist and low clouds, bore little resemblance to the clear photographs they had studied. Radio beacons that should have guided them to friendly airfields remained silent, either damaged by recent Japanese attacks or simply non-functional in the remote region. One by one, as fuel ran out and darkness fell, the B-25s faced the inevitable. Some crews attempted crash landings on beaches or in rice paddies, their pilots fighting to keep the heavy bombers level as they came down in unknown terrain. Others, with no suitable landing sites visible in the mountainous landscape, made the decision to bail out into the night sky over China. The parachute jumps, made in darkness over unfamiliar territory, scattered the crews across hundreds of square miles. Lieutenant Bill Farrow's crew came down in what they hoped was friendly territory, only to discover they had landed in a region controlled by Japanese forces. Others found themselves among Chinese guerrilla fighters who, despite language barriers, recognized them as allies and began the dangerous process of guiding them toward safety. Doolittle himself, after crash-landing his bomber in a Chinese rice paddy, spent his first night on the ground, convinced that the mission had been a failure. The loss of all 16 aircraft, the scattering of crews across enemy territory. It seemed like a catastrophic end to what had begun with such promise. The colonel could not yet know that his raid had achieved something far more significant than the physical damage inflicted on Japanese targets. In Tokyo, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. The Japanese High Command, which had assured the population that the home islands were invulnerable to attack, now faced uncomfortable questions. If American bombers could appear over the capital with so little warning, what other surprises might the enemy have in store? The raid's strategic consequences would unfold over the coming months, influencing Japanese military planning in ways that would ultimately prove decisive. But for now, in the hills and valleys of eastern China, 80 American airmen faced an uncertain fate, some in friendly hands, others beginning a long captivity, all of them having participated in one of the most audacious military operations in history. Their navigation across the Pacific had been flawless, their execution of the attack precise and professional. Whether they would live to see home again remained to be written in the dangerous days ahead. And escape and evasion. The morning mist clung to the terraced hillsides like gossamer veils, and Lieutenant Dean Hallmark found himself studying a landscape that seemed pulled from an ancient scroll. The rice paddies stretched in geometric patterns below, their surfaces mirror still in the dawn light, reflecting a sky that had carried him so far from home. The air held unfamiliar scents. Wood smoke mixed with something he couldn't identify, perhaps the sweet decay of vegetation in the humid valleys. Hallmark had been walking for 3 hours since abandoning his parachute in a bamboo grove. His navigation training had prepared him to read stars and calculate drift, but nothing had prepared him for the intricate challenge of moving unseen through a countryside where every face, every voice, every cultural marker was foreign. The paths that snaked between villages followed logic he didn't understand, ancient routes that curved around sacred groves and ancestral burial sites, avoiding the straight lines that Western military thinking preferred. 2 valleys to the south, Staff Sergeant David Thatcher crouched beside a mountain stream, cleaning wounds that belonged to his pilot, Lieutenant Ted Lawson. The bomber's crash landing had shattered Lawson's leg, and Thatcher, trained as a gunner, now found himself serving as medic, navigator, and protector. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, its sound masking the distant voices of search parties that had been combing these hills since sunrise. Thatcher understood the mathematics of their situation with brutal clarity. They were roughly 400 miles behind Japanese lines, in territory where the occupying forces had placed bounties on American heads. Their survival depended entirely on the discretion of Chinese civilians who had every reason to fear association with enemy airmen. Yet as he worked to clean Lawson's wounds, an elderly farmer emerged from the morning shadows, carrying not weapons or warnings, but a clay pot filled with boiled rice and a bundle of clean cloth. The farmer spoke no English, and Thatcher's Mandarin consisted of 3 phrases learned from a phrasebook during the Pacific crossing. But human compassion, it seemed, required no translation. The old man's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning wounds with a gentleness that spoke of tending injured animals, sick grandchildren, the countless small emergencies of rural life. His eyes, when they met Thatcher's, held a recognition that transcended language, the acknowledgement of one human being caring for another in circumstances neither had chosen. The terrain itself became both ally and enemy, as the scattered airmen attempted to navigate toward friendly lines. Eastern China's landscape had been carved by millennia of water and wind into a maze of ridges and valleys, each fold in the earth offering concealment but also confusion. The mountains rose in layers, their peaks shrouded in clouds that could hide American airmen from Japanese patrols, but also hide Japanese patrols from American airmen. Lieutenant Robert Hite discovered this truth as he followed what he believed was a merchant trail toward the coast. The path seemed logical, well-worn, clearly traveled, leading generally eastward through a valley that offered good concealment. But as the morning progressed, the trail began climbing toward a ridge that would expose him against the skyline. His navigator's instincts, trained to think in terms of great circles and celestial mechanics, struggled with the intimate geography of survival, where every decision carried immediate, potentially fatal consequences. The sounds of this landscape created their own intelligence network. Hite learned to distinguish between the normal rhythms of rural life, the lowing of water buffalo, the calls of farmers across terraced fields, the creak of wooden wheels on ancient carts, and the sharper, more urgent sounds that signaled danger. Bootsteps in military cadence, the metallic click of rifle bolts, orders barked in Japanese, cutting through the morning air like blade strokes. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these desperate hours was the network of assistance that seemed to materialize from the Chinese countryside itself. Villagers who had never seen Americans, who risked execution for harboring enemy personnel, nevertheless opened their doors and shared their rice bowls. They guided lost airmen around Japanese checkpoints, hid them in root cellars and grain storage buildings, treated their injuries with traditional remedies that proved surprisingly effective. Lieutenant Charles Ozuke found himself in a farmhouse where 3 generations lived under one roof. Grandparents who remembered the Boxer Rebellion, parents who had witnessed the Japanese invasion, children who had known only war. The grandmother, her feet bound in the old tradition, moved through the house with surprising speed, preparing a meal that transformed their meager stores into something approaching abundance. She served ozuk tea in a porcelain cup so delicate he feared it would shatter in his hands. Yet she insisted he drink, refilling the cup with ceremony that honored him as a guest, despite the mortal danger his presence brought to her family. The old woman's grandson, perhaps 8 years old, watched Ozuk with fascination, studying his flight suit, his equipment, his foreign features with the intense curiosity of childhood. The boy had fashioned toy airplanes from bamboo and rice paper, crude models that nonetheless captured the essential geometry of flight. When he showed them to Ozuk, his eyes held a question that needed no translation. Were these like the great metal birds that had carried the American across the ocean? As the day lengthened, the scattered airmen began to understand that their escape depended not on military training or technological superiority, but on the fundamental human capacity for courage in the face of impossible odds. Chinese farmers who owned nothing but their small plots of land risked everything to help strangers. Village elders who had survived decades of war and occupation made split-second decisions to trust their lives to foreign airmen they had never seen before. The rice paddies that had seemed so beautiful in the morning mist became highways of hope as local guides led the Americans along raised paths that connected village to village, following routes that had served smugglers and refugees for generations. Each step took them further from the crash sites, closer to the uncertain promise of friendly territory, deeper into a landscape where survival depended on the kindness of strangers who had every reason to turn them away. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of search parties continued. A reminder that freedom remained miles away, and the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. Legacy and reflection, the days that followed would blur together for those who survived, some finding sanctuary in the arms of Chinese resistance fighters, others enduring the harsh reality of Japanese captivity. But even as individual stories of survival and sacrifice unfolded across the Chinese countryside, something far more profound was taking shape. A ripple effect that would spread across two vast oceans and fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War. In Washington, the first fragmentary reports began filtering through diplomatic channels and resistance networks. Sketchy accounts of American airmen being sheltered by Chinese villagers, of bombing runs over Tokyo and Yokohama, of a mission that had somehow, impossibly, succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The War Department, which had prepared itself for complete disaster, found itself grappling with something unprecedented, a strategic victory born from what should have been a suicide mission. The psychological impact on American morale proved immediate and profound. For months, the nation had endured an unbroken string of defeats and humiliations. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies, each name a reminder of American vulnerability, of an enemy that seemed unstoppable. But now, suddenly, the narrative had shifted. American bombers had struck the Japanese homeland itself, had flown through the heart of the enemy's supposedly impregnable defenses and delivered a message that resonated far beyond the physical damage inflicted. The navigators who had made it all possible would carry different burdens in the years that followed. Some haunted by the memory of comrades who hadn't made it home, others struggling to comprehend their role in an operation that had exceeded every expectation. Lieutenant Charles McClure, who had guided his crew safely to Chinese territory, would later reflect on those 6 hours over the Pacific as the most intensely focused period of his entire life, a time when mathematics and intuition had merged into something approaching pure instinct. But it was the Japanese response that revealed the true strategic significance of what Doolittle's men had accomplished. In the weeks following the raid, intercepted communications revealed a fundamental shift in Japanese military thinking. The possibility of future attacks on the homeland, previously dismissed as logistically impossible, now dominated strategic planning sessions in Tokyo. Resources that had been earmarked for offensive operations were quietly redirected to home defense. Fighter squadrons recalled from forward positions, anti-aircraft batteries reinforced around major cities, naval units reassigned to patrol duties. Most critically, the raid accelerated Japanese plans for what would become the Battle of Midway, an attempt to draw the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement and eliminate the carrier threat once and for all. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, became obsessed with the idea that American carriers operating from secure bases could continue launching such raids indefinitely. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership proved as significant as any physical damage, their sense of invulnerability shattered by the sight of American bombers over their capital. The 16 navigators had achieved something beyond their technical calculations and celestial observations. They had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War through pure navigational precision. Every bearing they had plotted, every drift correction they had calculated, every star sight they had taken during that long flight to Japan had contributed to a psychological victory that would influence military planning for years to come. For the Chinese people who had risked everything to help the scattered airmen, the raid represented something equally profound. Tangible proof that the Japanese war machine was not invincible, that the occupying forces could be challenged and defeated. In villages across eastern China, the story of the American flyers would be passed down through generations, a reminder that courage and compassion could triumph over overwhelming odds. The technical achievements of the mission continued to influence military aviation long after the war's end. The navigation techniques pioneered during the training phase, the modifications made to extend the B-25's range, the carrier launch procedures developed specifically for the raid, all became standard elements of military doctrine. The navigator's insistence on backup calculations and redundant position-fixing methods would save countless lives in future operations. As the years passed and the full scope of the raid's impact became clear, historians would debate its true significance, some arguing that the physical damage was negligible, others maintaining that the psychological effects changed the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. But for those who lived through those desperate hours over the Pacific and the harrowing days that followed, such debates seemed almost irrelevant. They had done what was asked of them, had pushed their skills and courage to the absolute limit, and had somehow survived to tell the tale. The navigators who returned home would often speak of the profound silence that had filled their aircraft during the final approach to Japan, the moment when all their calculations converged, when months of preparation crystallized into a single point in space and time. In that silence, they had found something approaching mathematical poetry. The intersection of human skill and natural forces, of training and intuition, of individual courage and collective purpose. Tonight, as we reflect on their achievement, we can imagine those same stars that guided them across the Pacific, still wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, still offering the same celestial guidance to navigators who understand their language. The techniques may have evolved, the instruments grown more sophisticated, but the fundamental relationship between human skill and natural precision remains unchanged, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge applied with courage and determination. And so the legacy of the Doolittle Raiders endures, not merely in the strategic victories that followed, not only in the technical innovations they pioneered, but in the quiet demonstration that ordinary men, faced with extraordinary challenges, could rise to meet them with skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to their mission. Their calculations precise, their courage absolute, their navigation through the darkness of war guided by the eternal stars that continue to shine above us all, marking the same celestial paths they followed on that distant April morning when 80 young Americans changed the course of history through the simple act of finding their way home across an endless ocean that had tested every skill they possessed and revealed reserves of courage they never knew they carried within them.